Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon and happy Wednesday to all. Again, this is an NRRI program entitled Pathways to Successful Community Solar Programs Discussion. I'm the chair of the Colorado PUC, and prior to my appointment, I co-founded, co-owned, and ran a pioneering national solar development company called Community Energy. Although we were mainly focused on utility scale solar, we did a bunch of community solar in multiple states. While I still have some rough sense of what's going on in Colorado, I'm now years out of date on the rest of the community solar market, and I'm very much looking forward to this panel discussion to help catch up. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Jenny Heeter. Jenny is a senior energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Lab and an advisor to the DOE National Community Solar Partnership. Jenny, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Blank, and thank you, Tom, for hosting this session. I am going to provide a few slides on the National Community Solar Partnership and then talk about our market trends data that we collect here at NREL. The Department of Energy has run the National Community Solar Partnership for a number of years, and NREL as a national lab has supported the program as well. The program came out with a new goal, which is to provide the equivalent of 5 million households with community solar, along with 1 billion in energy bill savings by 2025. This is the first time the NCSP has announced a goal like this, of this magnitude. It is quite an increase from what we have today, as we'll talk about later, but basically would be going from about 3 gigawatts last year up to about 20 gigawatts of capacity across the country, and ensuring that bill reduction on average is about 20%. So a long way to go in a short amount of time. The partnership does that through 3 primary avenues. One is collaboration. So there is an online platform where folks can connect with each other. They also host a number of in-person and virtual meetings, webinars, tools, connections, things like that. The NCSP also funds NREL to do our data tracking, which I'll share a lot about later. And then there is also a no-cost technical assistance program. So if you have a question about how to deploy community solar, or what policy environment looks like in your state, or anything along those lines, there are subject matter experts at the national labs that can help, as well as from third-party experts. Next slide. So in order to get to the NCSP target, there are a number of specific engagement strategies that DOE is running. One is that technical expertise that I mentioned. The second is engaging with states, as well as providing access to capital, doing customer engagement, and then doing what they're calling a Hearts and Minds campaign. So really doing public awareness around community solar. Next slide. And just one more slide on the NCSP. They just launched a states collaborative, which I think is of interest to this audience because it is designed for folks who might be at the PUC or at another state agency tasked with implementing, or in some way related to community solar. So the collaborative has just started, and it will be a series of peer exchanges between states. It'll also have working groups on specific topics. Those topics are still being determined, but it'll be things like LMI community solar, resiliency, things like that as well. And there will be technical assistance that happens through that collaborative. Next slide. So that's the NCSP that DOE is hosting. And yeah, Tom, thanks for putting the link in the chat. I'm going to briefly run through some of our trends from our latest data on the community solar market. Next slide. We'll talk about market status and then some of the policy and market drivers, as well as pending community solar deployment. Next slide. And go ahead one more. Great. So at NREL, we track projects across the country. We've been doing this for a long time and have a database of all of the projects that we're aware of. In terms of what we define as community solar, we take into account whether the project has more than one off-taker, whether those off-takers voluntarily subscribed to the project, and then also whether the project provides a bill credit to the subscribers for the generation that their share produced. So that's kind of our fundamental definition of what we determine to be community solar projects. At the end of last year, we had about 5.2 gigawatts of capacity over about 2,000 projects. And these projects are in 40 states as well as Washington, DC. We also have a link to our project list if folks want to look up the projects in their states or things like that. We have that available online. Next slide. The market has grown quite quickly. So on average, it's grown about 131% year over year since 2010. And we did have about 1.8 gigawatts come online in 2021 alone. So this is a very rapidly growing market. And we'll see that growth has been, in different states and different markets over time. Next slide. We also track the size of these projects. Some people think community solar and don't really know what that means or how big that project might be or how many projects there are. So on the left-hand side, you can see that the number of projects is increasing over time. We're missing a few 2021 projects there just because of some data reporting issues, but we expect that 2021 number will jump up once we get full reporting on individual projects. Then on the right-hand side, you can also see that we had this sort of increase in project size over the 2010s, and then in late 2010s and 2020s, sort of starting to level out around that 2 megawatt, 1.5 megawatt threshold. Next slide. Great, so we want to present some of our state-by-state data. So in 2021, Florida took over as the first place state. They installed more than 1 gigawatt in 2021, and they're at about 1.6 gigawatts now. We do see just generally in the community solar market a lot of concentration among states. So about 92% of capacity is in the top 10 states, and about 75 is in just 4 states. So Florida, Minnesota, New York, and Massachusetts have seen most of the deployment. Next slide. This deployment has come in waves as states have enacted new enabling policies or frameworks for community solar. Initially, Colorado was the state leader. That's where I am at the National Renewable Energy Lab. But since then, we've seen Massachusetts and Minnesota start to take off in the 2016 to 2019 timeframe. And then more recently, as I mentioned, we have Florida and New York emerging as state leaders. Next slide. So next, we're going to talk about some of the policy frameworks in place in these states, and with the context of deployment, we can talk about how different policies have impacted deployment in different states. Next slide. So across the country, we're at 22 states as well as Washington, DC that have some type of enabling framework. This framework can vary. It can be just setting up the virtual net metering that enables community solar. It can also be in the form of mandating that a utility offer community solar or something similar to that. So these frameworks all vary, but the states in green essentially have some pathway for developing community solar projects. Next slide. One of our more recent research areas is looking at how these programs in states may be capped. So the concept of a cap has come about as states maybe have started piloting community solar. Regulators or others may have set a capacity limit. So saying, we're going to do a pilot program, it's going to be 300 megawatts, and then we'll evaluate after that. There have also been some utility-led programs, such as Florida Power and Light, that utility has gone to their regulator for approval of a specific amount of megawatts that they will develop. So we wanted to look at what are these caps, how might they be limiting or influencing deployment over time, and just get that lay of the land. That work is going to help inform the work we're doing for the state's collaborative. Will also help us understand how can DOE facilitate meeting their goal, which states might need to be opened up, which states might need to be added in terms of enabling policies, things like that. So more work we'll be doing here, but here's our current status. Next slide. I think I'll just breeze through this one, but just to say that caps vary all over the place. So Massachusetts and New York have caps that are over 3,000 megawatts and multi-year programs. Florida Power and Light with their current program is at about 1,500 megawatts. A lot of other states have much smaller caps. Next slide. All right, wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about low and moderate income community solar. These are programs that either require or incentivize LMI participation. We do see 20 states and DC having these types of programs. They have varied over time, and see how you can see the level of deployment under those programs on the left-hand figure. So in blue, we see the current installed capacity, and then in orange, that's planned capacity. So it's about 65 megawatts that we have now and a little over 200 in the queue. So it is a focus of a lot of states, but we are still yet to see a lot of deployment in that sector. Next slide, please. We also want to talk about, for LMI community solar, are those programs capped? So not as many of those programs are capped, only 7 plus DC have some type of cap in place. And in this case, we consider a cap could be a megawatt cap, or it could be a set amount of funding that's dedicated to LMI community solar. So I know we'll hear a lot more about Illinois later in this session, but we do consider states like Illinois to be capped because there is a cap on the total available funding. Next slide. Great, and last piece I wanted to talk about, one more, can go ahead, is pending capacity. So we are at about 5.2 gigawatts currently developed, and then we have over 6 gigawatts in the queue. It is also concentrated in a small number of states. So 4 states, Florida, New York, Minnesota, Massachusetts, have about 80% of that planned capacity. So we do continue to see this market being concentrated in a few number of states, but we also see some emerging states like New Jersey that has enabled programs and done some selection of projects that we just have yet to see come online. So with that, I think I will pass it back to the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Next, we have Tom Stanton, Principal Researcher at NRRI. Mr. Stanton has been working on renewable efficiency, smart grid, and climate issues for over 40 years, much of it in Michigan state government. Tom, you're up.
Thank you, Commissioner. First off, I'm giving a very brief definition slide. One of the things that we already heard a little bit is how no 2 states might have the identical definition for community solar and exactly what it is and exactly what goals are they trying to achieve. So these are a couple prominent definitions. I'm working on a research paper about community solar now, and so much of what I'll present today is the results of my research so far. And of course, I'm, along with everyone else, learning more as I go day by day from all the different experts around the country and from participating in the National Community Solar Partnership. One of the things that we provided to our audience today is a bibliography about community solar that I have been working on along with others. So I hope that you'll find that helpful as well. Several of the links are included in the presentation here. If we go to the next slide, please. Department of Energy has a community solar guidebook that's particularly for the local governments. And they talk about these 6 different major kinds of functions or kinds of goals and objectives that can be achieved, at least in part, using community solar deployment in communities. And they make the points here that are shown as quotes on the left, that the community solar is taking a much more important and active role in a lot of community decisions, and that it's up to the community leaders, not only legislators or regulators or utility companies, but community leaders themselves to participate. Let's go to the next, please. Department of Energy, in that same report, provides over 36 case studies, and each of those case studies addresses one of those 6 different kinds of goals and objectives. So I encourage you all to take a look at that report and study it to see what these real world examples are and how success is being implemented and then measured and evaluated in the programs that are going on. Next, please. As I did my research so far, I've identified these 5 major pathways that all seem to be repeating again and again and again in reports about what it means to have successful community solar. And now I'm going to go through each of the 5 in a little bit more detail. So we can go to the next slide, please. First is making sure that there's ample community participation, and that's on the part of many, many diverse stakeholders. And this includes the land use planning aspect, very often that is very important for local communities, and to get community support in the development of these facilities, especially by productive use of underutilized spaces. That's in the middle bullet point. And then another theme that comes up over and over again is the need to work with trusted local partner organizations. And we'll hear a lot more about that coming up in the other presentations today. Let's go to the next, please. Here are some of the keys for what it means to be able to maximize the benefits of a community solar project and then share those benefits fairly with all the participants. So trying to do stacking of the values to include utility system benefits is one very important aspect. Another is that there can be important community benefits in the realm of employment and economic development, reliability and resilience services, and other things like that. And one of the questions that has already come into us for this webinar is to discuss the idea that there may be specific community benefits that get negotiated with the project developers of any kind of community energy project, whether that's community solar or community wind or otherwise, that local communities very often want to make certain that benefits will accrue to the community members as a whole and not just participating customers. Customer benefits can be magnified by combining community solar with energy efficiency improvements, and we're already seeing some examples of programs that do that with very good results, achieving very large energy savings for the participating customers. Next, please. For the program design and tariff design itself, these are some of the keys that show up again in the literature about making sure that the choices for participation are flexible and allow a lot of range of investment and range of return. In my own case, my wife and I joined our municipal utility company community solar project by leasing panel number 1 out of 1,000 panels. And so it's a 1 solar panel participation that we have, but we're getting a little payment every month from that for our contribution towards the first community solar project here. The second bullet here talks about making sure that there are substantial utility bill cost savings for the participants, not only a rate decrease, but added bill savings that are visible to the participating customers. A third point is to make sure that we are making eligibility checks as simple as possible and not intrusive at all, especially for low and moderate income consumers, making the tests to determine eligibility as simple and straightforward as possible. And then at the bottom here, you see a lot of emphasis on being able to improve and standardize programs over time. And I know that's one of the big ideas behind the new community solar partnership efforts that are under that new DOE goal, is to try to do things to make sure that we can standardize programs so that they'll be easier to grow and easier to spread. Next, please. This is a reiteration of things we've talked about already, making the subscriptions simple, easy, flexible, making sure that the subscriptions are portable if the participants move from one location to another within the same project footprint, allowing transfers of subscriptions to other eligible recipients if someone has to drop out, and so forth. And then another theme that appears over and over again is that community solar is largely designed to help those people who cannot put solar on their own facilities. So making the options closely match the most popular options for those that are putting solar on their own site makes community solar kind of a logical opportunity for more people, and that goes a long way towards achieving success. Next, please. Oh, one more slide. There we go. Thank you. There's a big emphasis on making sure that there are adequate consumer protections. And one of the themes that comes up over and over again is that to a lot of people, community solar literally at first sounds too good to be true. So we really have a long way to go in terms of making sure that there's adequate consumer education and a set or a suite of consumer protections. And here's some of the places you can learn more about that. Next, please. And then another issue that comes up over and over again in the literature is that interconnections is where the rubber meets the road here, so that we need to be ready for more and more systems to be able to interconnect. And that involves making sure that the interconnection standards and procedures are up to date. And then in some important ways, different states are working on communicating the interconnection and grid planning needs through things like hosting capacity analysis and hosting capacity maps. And I've given you a couple links there at the bottom for some of those. Next, please. That's the end of my presentation. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Eric. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Kristal Hansley, CEO of WeSolar, a Maryland-based entity whose mission is to bring under-resourced communities affordable access to community solar and to assist commercial properties with energy efficiency. Kristal, you're up.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and I will be passing it forward from the previous speakers, carrying it forward. And next slide. So my section of today's forum is to just have a serious dialogue about WeSolar's view, and I'm a community solar enthusiast as far as how the market is really shaping out nationally. And our very unique lens, I'm the founder and WeSolar CEO. We are actually in Baltimore and in a census tract and an opportunity zone. And so my immediate community can be like, well, we're LMI, we're the community. We bring that authenticity, the trust that's been missing from a lot of the communication, because we have that cultural competency. And we can actually create a nice, I think, bird's view from our standpoint because of the disadvantages that's associated with, I would say, communities of color or underrepresented groups, just trying to carve out their share of the just transition. And so I have a chart that really hones in on what energy justice is. You've probably been hearing a lot about, oh, energy or equity or creating this just transition. And I believe that community solar really embodies what energy justice means. If you have a particular view or being intentional with how you deploy community solar, and that simply will come back to, well, what is community solar? In my version of that, I will sum up in the end. And so energy justice have like these key parameter, I would say, subjects that it really means a lot to the community. And a lot of the things that we're seeing in national justice advocacy groups is it needs to have economics. This is how you really make sure that the community is a part of the just transition, whether it's wind or community solar. And the economic point of view of community solar is obviously it creates savings for all subscribers. For most models, except for some, guarantees at least a 5% savings. If you're, a part of the workforce development and making sure that you have a robust program, you also include community development, work training forces, and bringing those green jobs to making sure that that's a part of the policy, and making sure that those groups are included in where these jobs, green jobs, are created, or where the community solar farms are built. That's also economics and how the community solar and how it also ties back to energy justice. And then obviously the environment, that's the most obvious. Any community solar program or solar deployed creates that the environmental decarbonization is offsetting your footprint, and helping us reach our goals, whether that's DOE's, 5 gigawatts by 2025, or CCSA's goal of getting to 20 gigawatts by 2030. And then that's the politics side, right? Like having real intentional policies. As you've seen in the previous slides, we have different models, right? If NREL.org had a really great chart as far as the main models that's existing in the sector. You have the vertically integrated and utility-led model, which is clearly have pros and cons when you look at, okay, what's happening in Florida, right? Like Florida has the largest scale of community solar, but then you have some pushback. It's just like, hey, you want scale, this is how you get scale, but is it really inclusive, right? And just to be frank, like WeSolar we're model agnostic, because as our vantage point, you will see why. And so you have pros and cons to the utility side, vertically integrated side. Then you look at the private entity side, and the politics and the main solar champions and the SEIAs and the different solar lobbying trade groups saying, look, it needs to be this way, which I would say out of the 22 states is really focused on the private entity model. And less, that includes the nonprofits, but mostly the transition of solar companies that did traditional rooftop solar, having the infrastructure in place to really carry it forward and be the main players when it comes to the development and deployment, the financing. And then their models really incorporate subscription management, third-party organization to really get into the trenches of community involvement. And how they do that, it's been, you might have some subscriber organizations that are really grassroots, and then you have some subscriber organizations to really create that community to bridge the language. And as we advocate for more education, because that's what's needed in the previous slide by my fellow cohort, that has been the bulk burden on the subscription management side. If you're looking at the private entity model within this space. And then you will have the co-op model, where you see a lot of nonprofits and small groups coming together, using their community resources. And obviously their pros and cons is that they are the community. They all gather their resources and acquire some financing, some green bank loans, and out of pocket to where they actually own the systems, subscribe to systems. But obviously their cons is interconnection, their cons is financing and scale, right? You can't literally have small groups doing like co-op models if we really want to reach some of those goals from CCSA or some of the goals from DOE. And then you have, I would say on the outskirts, the real community focused model, which is what we're advocating for, whereas in the present models that's existing, they all obviously have their pros and cons, whether you want scale, whether you want guaranteed deployment with you know, the most moderate version of what community solar looks like, even if you have like subscriber organizations at the top that's doing like bot or AI aggregation and communication, or if you're really at the co-op level and you're seeing like, okay, you're doing it from the ground up and you're so small and the resources are really stretched. But you know, there's obviously that authenticity, that's their trust, that is a less of a problem, and you don't really get the scam versions of, oh, this is a scam. Well, not if it's these community members that is very well known doing it, you don't get the scale. But in our model, as you know, underrepresented, you know, CEO and being in Baltimore, we're not really in a game of any model, right? Because when you look at energy justice, or when you look at a lot of the ongoing systematic like issues with inequality, if you're not directly intentional about making sure that your system is equitable, or have a direct impact on making sure underrepresented groups are part of the whole process, no matter what version you look at is leaving us out. And so when you look at all versions of those models, minority communities are not included, even with the cloak of, oh, this is for underrepresented communities, this is for LMI. And the issues you're seeing is because the very first word of community solar is community. If community is plugged in at all of those models from the beginning, you're going to have a viable product. And I can show you where each of those models, where there's cons or where we're having issues, if a community focused group or organization is brought in from the beginning, whether it's land leasing, whether it's financing, not bringing them and giving them the crumbs of the pie, or having, you know, what would you think if you were having a dinner party and someone came in and just crashed your dinner party? No, who are you guys? The first thing is this is a security threat, right? No, we didn't invite you here. So that's how it is if the community is engaged. Of course, people won't think it's a scam. No one is taking your dish at this dinner party. I didn't invite you. Who are you? Is anyone can testify to who this person is crashing our dinner party? And that's how communities feel. The best way is to be invited in. When you're invited in, it's just like, hey, where policies is changing. 22 states have this online. Another 19 have a version of this. We would like your feedback. And so my recommendation to commissioners, to regulators, to community is to take a step back, because everyone has their own lens as far as what's the issue, what's the problem, right? Because the problem is going to vary depending on what model, and obviously everyone has their own interests. But I would say for everyone is a community-focused lens going from the beginning helps all of those problems. And you name all of those issues within those models, you can see a plug and play, it fixes that. And that's my presentation today. And I look forward to the questions, and I will slide it on to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristal. Our final speaker is Brian Granahan, Chief Legal Counsel for the Illinois Power Agency, which oversees the electricity planning and procurement process for residential and small commercial customers of Illinois' regulated utilities. The agency also manages the implementation of Illinois RPS. Brian, you're up. Take us home.
Thank you so much, Chairman Blank, and thank you to Kristal as well. There's a few things, before I get into the very dense aspects of our slides here on the community solar experience in Illinois, there are a few things that Kristal said that just brought certain anecdotes to mind that I felt like I had to share. So the first is that we received an inquiry from a legislator, our office, the IPA, maybe about 2 weeks ago before an appropriations hearing, and they wanted to know what was happening with community solar project development on brownfield sites. And there wasn't actually any sort of carve out in Illinois law for brownfield site community solar project development specifically. But in their eyes, everything regarding community solar is about how do you take this land in your community that is not currently being put to any functional use and then repurposing it as a solar project. Then I had an experience on Saturday where I was getting together with a friend for a drink, and basically he said, you know, my wife wants us to sign up for this community solar project, But ultimately, I think it might be kind of a scam. And I said, oh, well, why do you think that? He said, well, they're offering me this $100 Amazon gift card, and they say there's going to be guaranteed savings. And to him, that's how he's seeing what's actually happening in the marketplace. And these are two diametrically opposed ideas of what community solar looks like in someone's eyes. And I think a lot of what Kristal said really rang true about having some sort of community aspect to it in order to overcome barriers of trust, or in order to have some education so that the customer actually knows what they're receiving. So as we get into the slides, Illinois, we have a bit of an overview on Illinois in the next slide. So a bit about Illinois. I know this is a national crowd. A lot of you may not be as familiar with our great state, but we're a state of 12.8 million people, about 8 million of which live in the Chicagoland area. That's important because as you think about community solar, if you're thinking about it from the standpoint of having a tangible relationship with the project, seeing something down the street from you, understand we have all of this land outside of where most people in the state live that is prime land for developing a project, or at least has the lowest possible land costs. We're a restructured state. We have a very active retail supply market. We've had retail electric suppliers offering products to residential small commercial customers for about the last 10 years. So there is that customer familiarity with green or renewable retail supply offers and the associated marketing, which I think covers a lot of people's experiences to date and may give them a negative first impression of community solar. We have the most nuclear power production in the US. We had a lot of wind projects developed across the 2000s into the 2010s, but really didn't see any solar development until about 2017 or so with the passage of some major legislation. So it wasn't the sort of place where you would see the solar panels in the house down the street to give you some sense of what everyone's relationship with solar looks like. Our agency, the Illinois Power Agency, the IPA, we are not just a beer, we also administer renewable energy incentive programs. That is our involvement with community solar. We're providing incentives back to try to get projects up and off the ground through the form of renewable energy credit delivery contracts, as we'll get into in the next few slides. So as we go to the next slide. So community solar in Illinois. This was not a concept before 2017 when a law took effect which gave rise to the establishment of virtual net metering for subscribers to community solar projects. And our program, the Adjustable Block Program, our major program for supporting community solar, opened up for project applications in 2019. So we've seen development basically from 2019, physical development of community solar projects until the present day. There are two programs that support the development of community solar projects. The Adjustable Block Program, which is our program that we use to support not just community solar, but also new distributed generation projects, and the Illinois Solar for All program, which is our low-income focused solar incentive program. Project development is supported through a 15-year renewable energy credit delivery contract. Those feature some form of prepayment. The price for RECs is administratively established by us basically looking at what we think the project needs to pencil out. And then like a declining block program that you might see in other states, there's a step down in that incentive level as projects participate and the program becomes subscribed. And then we do have adders for small subscriber participation. So that was something that has some language supporting it in the law and was intended to solve what was viewed as a real problem in other community solar markets, where sometimes you'd have these projects come online, but they'd be largely subscribed to by large commercial and industrial customers and weren't necessarily providing as much opportunity for residential and small commercial customer participation. So in Illinois, the customer receives a net metering credit in exchange for subscription. It's basically a financial relationship with the project. It could, in theory, be an ownership relationship, but we haven't seen that model emerge in Illinois, at least as of yet. That rate, that crediting rate, was previously set at the customer's actual supply rate, so it would be a different rate for your credit depending upon your supply source, which actually had some impacts in the market in terms of community solar projects wanting to get subscribers who are on the utility default rate as opposed to a retail supplier's rate. And then going forward, that credit will be a set value at what's known as the price to compare, which is a proxy for that default supply rate, regardless of where that customer is receiving their supply. Previously, community solar project size was capped at 2 megawatts, so you could have no project larger than 2 megawatts, although we did allow for co-locating 2 2-megawatt projects on the same or adjacent plots of land. Going forward, that has been raised to a 5-megawatt maximum project size. So you're not seeing something like a large 100-megawatt utility scale project, then using the subscriber model. That's not at least allowed under Illinois law. And then in terms of subscriber requirements, no one subscriber can be more than 40% of the project, and the subscribers must be in the same utility service territory as the project. Now that's actually a very broad geographic designation, because Illinois has two primary distribution utilities, Commonwealth Edison Company, which is basically the northern third of the state, and Illinois Company, which is basically the bottom 2/3 of the state. So you could be a subscriber to a project, but be a 3 or 4 or 5 hour drive away from that project. And that, again, may take things a little bit further away from what people think of when it comes to community solar. So as we go to the next slide, the adjustable block program opened up for project applications from developers wanting to develop community solar projects in 2019. We established some project application requirements to ensure that these were serious applications. So you had to have site control, you had to have an interconnection agreement, and then we had to figure out if we had more applications than we had slots available, how exactly were we going to choose between competing applications? And we ultimately landed on using a random selection process and having a developer cap of 20%. And then also preference for at least a 50% small subscriber commitment, but pretty much everyone went ahead and took that. Nevertheless, in the first 2 weeks of our program opening, which was our initial application opening window for all projects to be treated equally, we received applications from over 900 projects and couldn't support nearly that many. In fact, only 111 projects were actually selected, totaling about 200 megawatts of new community solar capacity. This is a little bit different in the Illinois Solar for All program side, where those are handled on a year-by-year basis. So as I think Jenny alluded to earlier, there is a financial cap or a budget cap on that program. So we take only as many projects as we can for a given year to meet that program. We're moving eventually to a model similar to that for the adjustable block program, but for our first opening, we had to meet certain aggressive 2020 delivery year targets for RECs from community solar projects. So we had a lot of project applications received and supported at once. So as we go to the next slide, attributes of selected community solar projects in Illinois. So again, 111 projects supported to date. That number is going to go up significantly in the next couple of years. About 215 megawatts, which means most of these projects are at or near that 2 megawatt size. So we're not seeing a lot of variety in terms of the types of projects that are participating in Illinois. Most of them are taking advantage of economies of scale. As it stands right now, 73 of those 111 projects are energized. Now here, this is in quotes because energized also means subscribed at a certain level to allow them to get the full incentive from the state. So the hurdle there is not just getting that project up and operating, but also putting subscribers into place. For Illinois Solar for All, 14 projects supported to date. Only 2 of those have become energized yet. That's 22 megawatts total. A much different range in terms of the style of projects, though, including more creative models, such as a 20 kilowatt project. And then additional funding has recently been authorized for the current program year. So our current program year is going to support more project applications in the coming months. So as we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about subscriptions and subscribers, because I think this is a very important part of community solar. It's not just about the project getting up and getting online, but also who is participating. What we've seen from the adjustable block program, which is our general program to support transactional or regular community solar projects, is over 25,000 presently active subscribers, 92% of which are active subscribers are considered to be residential. So we have a huge residential share of the pie in Illinois when it comes to who is subscribing to community solar projects. What we've seen from subscription offers are generally very transactional in nature, a 10 to 20% off your supply rate. So if your supply rate is 6 cents per kilowatt hour, maybe you're being charged 5 cents per kilowatt hour in your subscription fee, and you're getting a 6-cent credit back in the form of net metering on your bill. Generally easy exit, again, more of a transactional relationship with the project where you're kind of coming in and coming out, but not necessarily one where you have a tangible relationship with that project, or for that matter, you're choosing that particular project for any reason. For the Illinois Solar for All program, which is our low-income program, there are requirements related to subscribers needing to be low income, except for an anchor tenant, which is allowed per project. Over 4,500 subscribers from projects supported to date, we expect will ultimately be supported. There's a 50% minimum savings requirement for Solar for All. So this is intended to provide a lot more value back to those low-income participants, and there's partnerships with community-based organizations required. So slightly different approaches here as between the two programs, which you would expect, with one being a low-income focused program. So as we go to the next slide, I have some interesting, this is an interesting map. This is by zip code. So you're looking at this is where individual subscribers, kind of a heat map of individual subscribers to projects by zip code across Illinois. Like, this isn't that important insofar as it doesn't say that much, but what you do see is a lot of statewide diversity. So you don't see clusters necessarily around individual projects. Where you do see clusters, it's generally because that's more of a dense urban area and the zip code has more population. Whether this is good or bad or desired or not desired is really a matter, I think, for others to assess. But right now, as it stands, at least, outside of some of the more rural counties in Illinois, most counties in Illinois at least have some form of participation in community solar projects. And then as we go to the next slide after this one, this is the median income by zip code by the number of subscribers. So the x-axis here is the number of subscribers on community solar projects. The y-axis is the median income for that zip code. So this is not individual subscriber median income, which is not information that we have, but it is just some proxy for where those subscribers are coming from and what that area might look like. This was put together by Mayanna Campbell at Incline, our program administrator for the Adjustable Block program. And I think it's really terrific representation, because I think what it shows is that I don't know that there's a huge positive correlation, at least in Illinois, between income and community solar subscriptions. Now, there's a few different narratives that could come out of that. I'm not sure any of those are right. I'm not sure any of us are in a position to say what's right. But I think what you see is that across all different areas, there's some level of community solar participation. There's some areas that happen to have a lot, and you can see how that might happen if someone has a specific initiative where they're targeting a certain organization or targeting maybe a municipally endorsed offer or something along those lines that creates those more extreme examples. But by and large, otherwise, you see fairly even distribution across the state in terms of who is participating in community solar projects. This is also just for the Adjustable Block program. So this is not for Solar for All and does not include those low-income customers who are participating on Illinois Solar for All projects. So as we go to the next slide, a little bit on successes and challenges from this first phase of community solar project development in Illinois. Successes, I would classify the significant developer interest resulting in many more project applications than we had slots available as probably a success. It's better than the alternative where we couldn't successfully develop projects, although it created a whole cascade of other issues that we ended up having to manage. Low project attrition. Once we awarded REC delivery contracts, we've only seen 7 or 8 of those 111 projects not able to be developed. And then a few projects were able to come off the wait list and take their place. So we haven't had huge problems with projects submitting applications in and then not being able to follow through from them. Most of the offers we see for subscriptions are cost savings to customers. We think that's very important, especially in a retail choice market, because you also have green and renewable clean energy retail supply offers being marketed many times above market. And we want to create some sort of distinct lane for community solar here so the customer understands that this is a different value proposition than those retail supply offers. Cost savings isn't the only way to do so, but it's one important way to do so. And then statewide geographic diversity of projects and subscribers. It's been successful, although there's different ways of looking at project diversity. We haven't maybe achieved projects in, say, urban or suburban areas. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, again, a matter of your perspective and what you want to see out of community solar. But when you look at a whole map of the state, the projects are spread pretty evenly throughout the state. Some of the challenges, this project homogeneity. We have a lot of projects that basically look the same. They're large projects using low land costs in agrarian areas, built to the maximum possible size, and then using a very transactional model of bringing subscribers onto the project. This is resulting in a lack of a community connection to projects. So where is the community in community solar? You get maybe more of that in Illinois Solar for All, but so far for the Adjustable Block program, what we've seen is subscribers looking at this as a product and not necessarily looking at it as a relationship with the project. Again, potential subscriber distrust, this idea that people are a bit confused about competing both retail supply offers and community solar subscriptions in the same market. And then some of the workforce and DEI challenges. There's been a lot of critiques offered that say, well, workers may not be paying enough money. There's workforce coming in from out of state in this initial phase of projects. And we're not seeing representation in who owns projects, who's developing projects, who's working on projects in a way that reflects the priorities of the state in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we go to the next slide. Many of those items, those successes and those challenges were addressed through what's called the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in Illinois. This was signed into law on September 15th, 2021. So as I'm sure many of you can appreciate, we're still in the throes of implementing many of its new provisions. Under that, 250 megawatts of presently waitlisted projects, so out of that first set of 900 plus projects, are set to be developed, and developers were able to come back to us and provide their portfolio of which projects they chose off the waitlist to be developed. And we're in the process of reviewing those portfolios literally as of Monday of this week. Also calls for a massive expansion of both the Adjustable Block Program and Illinois Solar for All program budgets. This means we'll be supporting many more projects being developed annually than we would have been previously. Just to give you some sense of scale, our overall RPS budget is going from about $230 million a year to about $590 million a year. So we're seeing project development growing in a corresponding way. As mentioned previously, the maximum community solar project size goes from 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts. We have new equity-related workforce requirements. So prevailing wage is required to be paid in community solar projects. Then you requirement for project labor agreements, for instance, on utility scale projects. And then we have a new category within the Adjustable Block Program for participation from what are called equity eligible contractors. So that's at diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and community solar projects can participate in that category. That constitutes 10% of the overall Adjustable Block Program that grows over the next 10 years to 40%. There is a new community-driven community solar category. It's about 1/6 the size of the broader, more transactional community solar category, but it's specifically intended to support projects that provide a little bit different benefits back to the community and really put the community in community solar. And then also there's the question of how do we select projects from the more transactional community solar category going forward. Again, we had previously used a lottery for this. Our initial draft long-term renewable resource procurement plan proposed a scoring system looking at qualitative aspects of projects. There's still industry trade associations and others who say, look at the earliest interconnection agreement date. This is something that we're still working through. We will have a proposal and a plan that we file with our state's Public Utilities Commission on March 21st, and then that will be litigated before that Public Utilities Commission over the next 120 days. So this is an overview of where everything is at in Illinois. More than happy to respond to any questions, provide clarification on any of these items, and hopefully this has been a good and educational presentation.
Thanks to you, Brian, and thanks to all 4 panelists for a set of fantastic presentations. If you guys could turn your cameras on, that'd be great. I'll start with the definitional issue. Tom and Jenny, you defined community solar mainly around customer choice. Brian and Kristal talked more about community links and relationship as a critical element where project size and location matter. Tom or Jenny, any thoughts about a narrow, more community-based definition? Under your approach, could we have a 50 megawatt community solar project and keep it within the definition of community solar? Kristal, I see you smiling, so maybe you want to go first.
Yeesh. I think, again, as long as community is brought to the table at the beginning of the development process, then there's an equitable community lens, right? If you bring community organizations that can be a partner in the financing, if there's a underrepresented group that's the landowner, whereas the land lease, there's economic benefits from that. If, you know, they would hit a lot of farm or agricultural land, and that's pretty much where that would be if it's a 50 megawatt project. So there's ways in which definitely community can be a part of that model as long as they're at the beginning of the process.
Brian, you seem to be shaking your head. Yes?
No, I definitely agree. The one piece that we struggle with sometimes is taking qualitative language and reducing it down to a system through which we can evaluate applications and say, this one meets the bar, this one doesn't, or this one gets 5 points, this one gets 4 points, this one gets 3 points. And when you're in the business of awarding incentive contracts, that can provide a legal risk as well. So sometimes it's about taking that down one step and making sure that someone just gives something that is purely good intentions, and they actually have something behind it, and you can make a determination that one is better than the other. That's the one place I think where we sometimes struggle with that approach.
Fair enough. Tom, Jenny, you guys ready to narrow your definition? Or
I would not be ready to narrow the definition because I think it so much depends on what the state has to say about it. So if the legislature has defined this in a certain way, if the legislature has assigned certain objectives to the commission to consider, then I think those are the choices that have to be built into the program design. And so I'm not trying to prescribe one way or another, but I do think part of the essence here that we see across programs is the idea that a participating customer makes some financial contribution to participate, and then they get a reward for that participation based on solar output, usually measured in kilowatt hours.
So Jenny, we're letting 50 flowers bloom here, but you're setting national targets. So so how do you think about this definitional issue?
Yeah, it can be hard because community solar means a lot of things, different things to different people. And in terms of tracking projects, when we started this work, we had to think about, well, how do we determine whether something is community solar or is just solar in the community? So installed on a community building and net metered to that facility. Is that community solar, or is that solar that's benefiting a specific entity in a community? So the definitional issues are hard. Where we have landed is really focused on that benefit to subscribers, and that subscribers have that choice. But on the NRL side, we do provide our project list. So if folks want to take a look at that and they feel like, you know, we're really interested in projects under 10 megawatts, you could sort the project list and just look at stuff under 10 megawatts. So that's, yeah, kind of where we landed, is we're just going to track everything that we feel like meets our definition. If folks want to parse it out in different ways or add additional components to that, that's certainly great. And yeah, up to folks how they want to run with that data.
Fair enough. Tom and Brian both mentioned that community solar can be viewed as too good to be true, and that good programs provide participants with material bill savings. Jenny talked about some states limiting community solar capacity, and Brian talked about budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. For me, at its core, community solar programs offer developers and customers virtual net metering bill credits at retail rates that can often be high, basically for purchasing the output for in front of the meter solar projects, which could often otherwise sell at wholesale. One aspect of this is that it can create significant developer profit and maybe non-participant rate impacts. And, you know, our first questions from the audience ask about non-participant rate impacts. So the question to the panel is, how worried are you, and how worried should someone like me be about non-participant rate impacts, especially as these programs scale with you know, the DOE goals? One thing that works at 4 or 5 gigawatts is a very different proposition at 20 gigawatts. And, you know, we've already heard Illinois is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So I just asked the panel, any thoughts on non-participant rate impacts? And maybe I'd start with you, Tom.
Well, again, this is something that has to be decided state by state. There have been many efforts to try to measure any non-participant impacts and determine if there are subsidies or cross subsidies going among different ratepayer groups. I think that the linkage between retail price and solar price or solar value is gaining a lot more attention, and that the old model that we had for net metering, we're seeing replaced in many states, one by one, going to a net metering 2.0 model or a net metering 3.0 model, where we're going to be doing more of a value assessment and basing the credit for solar that's produced and delivered to the grid on the value of that energy that's delivered to the grid. So that should help remove any sort of artificial profit level that would have been there if we were offering only retail exchange.
Kristal, you think we can get enough participation, or are you confident that Tom and good regulation is going to squeeze out the subsidies. Developers seem awful excited by these programs, given what's going on in Colorado and Illinois. Any thoughts? Are we going to get a lot of low-income participation and make this fair?
I think there's a lot of potential as long as the language is translated by the stakeholders in the community, and they're the ones that's leading the charge. Then to me, that makes the projects more viable across the board. And I believe that the subscribers are very enthusiastic about signing up, where the savings are obviously not a scam and in perpetuity in a sense. And it just has to, you see $50 on the ground, who wouldn't pick it up? If they can't see it, then they can't pick it up, or if it's not understood, that's the reason why. And so as the policies in all these different states catch up, right now it's kind of like a nice experiment to see like what model works and who's doing it best. And before we start heavily regulating it, I think the market is kind of like showing the appetite and showing in real life feed the issues. And if we don't try to overuse our hand to artificially create what they think, just kind of just sit back and fill in the gaps as we pursue this new like fourth industrial revolution in the community solar vertical within the solar space.
Brian, what do you think? You worried about non-participant rate impacts and spending hundreds of millions of dollars, or you're big enough and the benefits are there?
Well, I think in moving forward, the latest legislation that was certainly front of mind for a lot of members of the General Assembly in deciding what sort of rate impact cap they had an appetite for. I think what Kristal just said about this sort of new revolution, though, is important, because these issues, the cross-subsidization across different parts of society exists not just in energy policy and certainly not just in community solar policy, but they exist in pretty much all the choices that policymakers make. I mean, our interstate highway system features some form of cross-subsidization, but it isn't necessarily brought into focus in quite the same way. I think to the extent you should be concerned about it, a lot of it has to do with any potential regressive impacts. And that's why you have things like our Illinois Solar for All program, and you have other ways to make carve-outs for low-income participation to try to ensure that at least those who might be bearing some of the financial burden of it can be best positioned and are not in the best position to do that, can also be best positioned to receive some of the benefits.
So should we be making community solar mostly or all for low-income customers? I mean, to the extent we're allocating scarce access, is that one way to do it, Kristal?
Are you talking about just automatic opt-out? So therefore, if you have a policy, and there's a lot of different like municipalities that's weighing the opt-out, and there's, is that actually community solar? If the choice and Jenny's, version of what community solar is, the subscriber one has a choice. And so, yeah, if you're, taking kind of like this socialist approach, like we're making a decision for everyone, even if it's in their benefit. And if they choose not to save money, then they can opt out. Who would do that? It just depends on the constituency and the state policy. I can just give you politically, geographically, that's not going to really weigh well in purple states or red states. That's really kind of like not what we believe in. And more progressive states or middle of the road might say, we don't really know what's happening. And if we do believe something is a scam and it's really not, and a state really and environmentalists got the legislation right for our own benefit, then we see the savings directly applied to our utility bill. And obviously it's not a scam. And, depending on how that plays out. And that's a really nice case study for NREL and any of the research groups that's like on the front lines of the research and really seeing the trajectory of the industry overall.
Jenny, you want to jump in? Non-participant rate impacts, allocating a bunch of the participation, low-income customers, wherever you want to go.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on the auto-enrollment piece. So there have been some efforts to look at what are ways where you can auto-enroll low-income customers in community solar. For example, if they're already on a LIHEAP benefit, could you take those LIHEAP customers and then also give them community solar? It would need to be like an opt-out model, so people would if they didn't want community solar, they could say no, but they would be automatically enrolled. I would say those pilots and discussions are really still evolving, and I don't think people have thought through, what issues does that pose then in terms of, is that community solar? If people are just getting a rate discount on their bill automatically, does it have that community feel that we've wanted to see, or a lot of folks have wanted to see in the community solar space? But the issues of being able to subscribe people automatically and the cost savings and just the ability to provide benefits quickly and easily to folks, I think is of interest in this market.
I hadn't heard that for a program based on choice. Doing an opt-out version is interesting. Brian?
We've had arguments like that in Illinois. I think the position of our agency, and we probably published something to this effect, is that the core value of community solar is someone choosing to be a member of that project. And once you move towards something like an opt-out model, because you say the value proposition to them is purely cost savings, then the other part of the value proposition are the socialized benefits of more renewable energy production, there are way more cost-effective ways to just accomplish only those two things than through a community solar model. So to us, I think a core aspect of it is that the customer is choosing to, and as we take the longer view of the value of these programs, a lot of it is the education of the customer that comes through their active participation on the project. So I think this might get at some of your concerns about cross-subsidization as well, is that we're not just trying to accomplish something in year one, we are trying to basically accomplish something over the longer term of transforming our energy system to something that's lower carbon, something that's more diversified, and part of that is customers understanding how to engage with these projects. So I think that's an essential component of it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add, what makes that process even more complicated is the idea of, if you have the opt-out model, then you also eliminate the integrated billing issue, because some states are still doing the two billing system because we don't have that policy that have like the similar community choice on the supplier retail side. And also obviously lowers the customer acquisition cost. But if you still have the integrated billing issue, then clearly, and on the side of the developers, you want an opt-out model.
Well, just following up on something Brian said, I appreciate the educational component of this, and like just having smaller projects in individual communities, you just drive by and there's a real value in an educational component that's linked to the consumer choice. Tom, anything you want to jump in? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, when I think about how to make these work for low-income consumers, I think about making the deal so attractive that any customer can participate. And then I think low income could come in the normal course of events. We have to make this work like the very best systems for putting solar on buildings for people. And so that includes the leasing programs that have no money down, monthly repayments for the equipment that are lower than the monthly bill savings. And then I'm seeing in the programs that do combine together energy efficiency with renewable energy offerings like this, very, very substantial bill savings that could be very attractive to even very low income consumers. And if we figure out how to resolve those questions and make these programs available to landlords and tenants and to the very low income participants, then I think it can help it grow for everyone, not just that group, but anybody regardless of income being able to participate, because we've got such a robust program design.
Anybody else? Jenny, you want to jump in? Then
yeah, go to Kristal if you want.
All right, Kristal.
Yeah, I would say, the clear model of what Tom is saying is DC model, right? When you look at, they have the highest recs and their LMI product offering is 50%, but there was still 2,000 people left to be acquired in like last year. It's education and obviously making sure that the development is equitable and the financing is equitable. And so even when you have the most attractive program for LMI customers with the highest savings and the incentives for the developers with the highest recs, it's still a problem of customer acquisition. And so again, if the community is engaged or the people that reflect the development process is brought to the table, then that will also eliminate that, even in the most attractive model, from my opinion.
Nice. No, that makes sense. Jenny, did you want to jump in? I saw you had your hand up.
No, sorry, I accidentally clicked on raise hand. I was
Okay.
trying to view the questions.
I'm going to follow up the next question, something Tom said about linking solar with efficiency, and I'm going to take it one step further and talk about storage. You know, in Colorado, over time, we're starting to squeeze the coal and natural gas out of our system, and our sort of highest loss of load probability hour is increasingly moving later in the day, to 7 to 9 p.m., you know, as the solar tails off. Should we be looking at adding storage to our community solar offerings? And any advice on how, if we're doing 20 gigawatts of standalone solar, and I, as a former developer, I would think that adding storage when you do the solar is probably the most cost-effective way to do that. So any thoughts, Kristal? You seem to be smiling.
Come back to me. I mean, I want to see what my fellow panelists say.
All right. Brian, Tom, you want to jump in? You talked about efficiency. What do you think about storage?
Sure, I think storage is definitely going to be a big part of this picture. And it comes into play in many different ways, but as we get the rate structure properly incentivizing use according to time and location, then I think the developers are just easily going to come in and bring packages that include some of each. When we look at how to maximize the community benefits, we're seeing a lot of ideas about putting the community solar at the facilities that are needed for critical needs in the community and shelters in the community and so forth. And they could very easily combine some storage with some community solar. So I think the rate design is pushing us in that direction, and the technology is pushing us in that direction in a really profound way. And I think it will come quite naturally. I do know that in New York State already, they have the opportunity for community storage projects with or without community solar, just because the same kind of model can apply separately. And we could do some community aspects with wind, storage, solar, efficiency, microgrids, critical need facilities. There are just lots of options out there. I'm encouraged by the idea that if we can really involve the communities in the discussion and the planning, like Kristal is talking about, I think we'll have 1,000 different wonderful ideas about how we can maximize these values.
I just say it took us 5 years to get time of use rates done, and then even then, our off-peak started at 7 p.m. So there may be a little more friction there, Tom, than you're suggesting. Brian, you know, what do you think? Is Illinois looking at combining community solar with storage, or you're going to wait for your legislature to do it?
Yeah, the Illinois Commerce Commission is just undertaking an analysis of potential storage policy ideas. I will say, as an hourly pricing customer, I don't envy you for having to wait that long for time of use rates in Colorado. But whether it makes sense to pair storage with community solar, I think there's a couple dimensions to that question. One is, what is the best means of addressing the problem of, say, peak shaving? And there's a number of different strategies, and so storage is merely one of those strategies. And then the second is, where does it make the most sense to site storage? And I don't know that at least the developments that we've seen in Illinois, where you have these kind of modular 2 megawatt facilities built in agrarian areas, if that's where it necessarily makes the most sense. It could be siting them closer to load centers, but then in the long run, it could be the case that community solar is actually sited closer to load centers too. We're just not at that point quite yet. So I think there's a broader system analysis that needs to be undertaken. Thankfully, our Public Utilities Commission in Illinois is engaged in that right now. And for us at the IPA, it's the sort of thing where if the legislature tells us to do it, then we're about implementing it, but we don't always have to ask ourselves those questions, which is great because it requires a lot of technical and engineering capacity that I don't have. I'm a lawyer, so.
Oh, fine. Put it on the regulator.
It's too speculative at the moment. It's just like, look at what Tom said. look at how fast storage battery technology is changing. Like, it's literally like every year gets better and more efficient, and it's bigger batteries. And so if you're a developer and you have like the old model on your system that's there for 20 years, you feel screwed. Like, oh my God, I just wasted all this, and this new farm that just popped up, you know, next year have the latest. It's too early. The technology is literally changing too fast to have that requirement, and regulators should definitely take a step back and make sure that their feasibility analysis is correct before like coming in and forcing anything, especially when storage technology is growing and moving too fast.
And one thing I'll say also is it's not one size fits all across states. You know, the big policy debate in Illinois that accompanied the changes to our RPS was how do we keep thousands of megawatts of nuclear power online. And that's not a problem a lot of other states have, where they're looking at this generating fleet that already exists in their state that's carbon free, and they're asking themselves, how do we keep that baseload generation and that floor as high as it's presently been? So we have different problems to solve for here than you do in other areas where maybe they don't have the same amount of land in order to develop new projects. So they might be looking, say, at offshore wind and other possibilities, or they're not at the crossroads of two different RTOs and number of transmission lines, or they don't have the same sort of baseload generation. So each state's going to approach these problems differently based on its own resources and its own situation.
Jenny, did you have any support for me, or am I on my own here?
Yeah, I would say I agree with what everybody has said. It is very state and electricity system specific in terms of what are the needs for storage, how can storage play going forward generally. In terms of the intersection between storage and community solar, we have seen Massachusetts and New York have incentive programs that incentivize putting storage with a community solar project. So not just any solar project, but a community solar project. And then we also see kind of in this, what we call community solar adjacent market of behind the meter storage paired with solar on a facility that might be used for resiliency purposes. So it could be a community center, it could be multifamily affordable housing, just interest in that kind of supporting resilient operations. Some of those projects may be subscriber models, but most of them probably are not. So yeah, really, yeah, the PUCs have a lot of work to do to figure out, what are the priorities and how is the grid going to evolve? So it's not an easy answer.
I'm not loving this record, so I'm going to move on. I think interconnect queues in Minnesota, Massachusetts, New York, and increasingly Colorado are getting overwhelmed by filings by community solar developers. Any thoughts on how to better manage the queues or allocate scarce interconnect access, first come, first serve? In Colorado, we're actually competitively bid SREC contracts, so we can allocate it that way. I remember personally losing a lottery in Illinois once, so I don't know if that's going on. So any thoughts on how to manage interconnect queues? Tom, you wanna start, or like someone else to start? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute, sorry.
I can say that NREL has done some fabulous work on interconnection and has done ongoing work about hosting capacity and all the different tools and techniques that we have for facilitating interconnections so that they can go faster and get the information that's needed out to the potential community solar developers so that we can put the community solar where it's going to do the most good and most easily get it installed and up and operating. And it's a big issue around the country, and many utilities still have a lot to do internally to get their systems ready to take advantage of the latest information about how we can do it.
Jenny, any guidance?
Yeah, I would say the interconnection issue is, across solar and across lots of technologies, not just community solar. At NREL, yeah, we have done some work looking at interconnection timelines and ways to reduce those timelines, some best practices. So I can dig up that report and put it in the chat. We've also, on the residential interconnection space, done a lot of work through the Solar app, which is a automated permitting app that local governments can use to reduce interconnection approval processes from local governments. So yeah, there's a lot that could be done there that, yeah, we're working on and DOE is working on, but it's a big issue as we see a lot more solar come online.
Brian, any thoughts from Illinois? I think the lottery is now gone.
Yeah, and we're looking at other ways, because then what's written into law is first come, first serve, but then you have to have some window, otherwise it turns into some sort of ticket master concert process, where everyone's just pressing their mouse button at 12:01. So we decide that we're going to go with a 1 day window, and the question becomes, well, you're getting more applications on day one than you will have slots available. So now what do you do? And I think what you see is a tension between developers who say, okay, first to be in the interconnection queue should mean first to have rights to a REC delivery contract or some sort of other incentive. And then you see policymakers, whether it's our agency or members of the General Assembly, who look at this more qualitatively and say, what is a deserving project? Does it carry certain attributes that we think meets other ends? And that tension still exists. It's going to be a big part of, I think, our next proceeding, where we file our long-term plan on March 21st, and it gets litigated over the next 120 days. I'm sure we'll be fighting about this in some way, shape, or form, regardless of what we propose in that plan.
Kristal, any experiences to share from your history, how you navigate interconnect, or you're more partnering on the back end on subscriber sign up?
Listen, we're in our early stages. We have 8 megawatts that we're developing with a large anchor tenant. And as far as like siting and interconnection, we did our feasibility studies to make sure that that's, feasible first. And so we will see. We'll keep you updated. So it's really good to have friends at the utility side, and, making sure that we exercise our community power. I've seen a lot of projects get stuck in that queue, and I've seen like community members on Twitter call out some of the folks that can literally like get their queues, get that stuff like processed expeditiously, and the community made sure that their projects were, dealt with first, and that was across different states. And so again, if you have 100 people that was brought in from the process, they'll make sure and hold those people accountable, which in my case, I've seen their interconnection issues like disappear overnight.
Well, given that we're in our last 6 minutes, I've been trying to incorporate audience questions into my questions, but I'm just going to read a couple of audience questions. Do states or utilities tend to offer on-bill credits for solar generation, or are third parties responsible for a separate bill to customers? Is this differentiated for LMI customers as compared to other customers? I think I might know the answer to that, but Tom, you wanna go?
I think of that as a program by program difference. In the program that I belong to, a third party does all the separate solar crediting, and not our utility. And it depends very often on the utility's billing system and the data that the utility has access to in order to figure out how are we going to account for the credits and give the credits. So it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. There are many places where it's a third party.
For Brian, is there a separate funding source that subsidizes the community solar costs to achieve the 50% savings for the LMI subscribers?
No, in theory, that's wrapped up in the REC price. So basically, we're setting our incentives with certain assumptions in mind. And there is a separate source of funding to fund the overall Illinois Solar for All program, which is a state-administered fund in addition to the general ratepayer collections. But that's true for all of the other programs, not just community solar, that fall under Illinois Solar for All.
Okay. To Kristal and other panelists, what have you seen as the most successful way to engage the community and increase participation? As a regulator, we often consider this to be the job of the utility. should we encourage them to partner with community education and help them do that?
Yeah, simple. Encourage, incentivize, maybe possibly regulate that they have a partner, co-development partner that's the community and representing that. And I will apply that to all models. If the community, again, is brought in from the beginning, it's their project. And so you don't have to convince someone who started with you to be a part of it. It kind of like cancels out that issue.
I appreciate it.
Jenny provided an appendix that talks about a lot of the details state by state of what's going on with community solar. So audience, be sure to look at the rest of the slides on your own and follow up with what is in that appendix. And then, as I mentioned at the very start, we also sent you the bibliography on community solar. Very much appreciate your participation today and all the great questions that came in. Let's keep this conversation going, please. As I mentioned, NRRI is working on a paper about community solar, and we're more than happy to make sure that we're trying to answer your questions as we go forward in that work. Thank you so much for joining us today, and all the panelists for keeping us on time. And I hope everyone has a great weekend here.